Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liberty Chats, a podcast from the Steamboat Institute. My name is Cody Wisniewski, and I'm a member of the Steamboat Institute's Emerging Leaders Council, a leadership program out of the Institute. And I'm excited to be here with you today. My guest today is Dr. James Lindsay. James is an American-born author, a mathematician, and a professional troublemaker. James has written 6 books spanning a range of subjects, including religion, the philosophy of science, and postmodern theory. He is the leading expert on critical race theory, which leads him to reject it completely. He's the founder of New Discourses, and he is also the author of a particular book that we are going to be discussing a little bit here today, How to Have Impossible Conversations, which you can't see on the video, a very practical guide. And that is along with his co-author, Dr. Peter Boghossian. Now, James, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I'm curious, what inspired you and Dr. Boghossian to write this book about having these impossible conversations?
Well, at the time, we were watching. So we wrote the book in 2017. So, flash back to the before times. At the time, we were watching the quality of political discourse rapidly degrade. We now see how much it has degraded. And it also rests within Peter's expertise that kind of crossed over with some of the expertise that I had been developing in terms of understanding how to communicate and how to nourish and maintain relationships and so on. So it seemed at the time to be a very important book to try to get people talking before the calamity. And now I think it's actually very interesting because although we wouldn't have thought of it at the time, now it's very interesting because what we're seeing is a lot of cross ideological coalitions forming. It's like we've seen that kind of, in a sense, the so-called woke movement, first of all, doesn't really converse very well. But second of all, it's almost like the aliens have descended and they have a completely different set of rules. And we all kind of or many of us are starting to realize that we need a very broad tent coalition that doesn't care if you're, Republican or Democrat, left, right, libertarian, conservative, liberal, whatever. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, Asian, Jewish, Middle Eastern. What doesn't matter. Straight, gay, man, woman. We've got to start figuring out how to form a coalition to fight this completely different way of approaching the world. And because that coalition is spanning so many ideological differences, those people need to be able to talk to each other and to be able to get along and to be able to set aside their differences and focus on their commonalities. And so it turns out to be very fortuitous that it's there and we wrote it, I think.
Yeah, and I think it was very poignant for the Steamboat Institute's Emerging Leaders Council. So, we've been talking about how to have these conversations, and we all read this book. But Steamboat Institute also focuses on hosting debates and having these kind of lively discussion that you really don't see anymore. But what I was really impressed with the book in particular was that it operates as a kind of a reference guide. It walks you through the steps and it tells you how to have these, or at least helps you understand how to have these conversations. And I'll add, obviously, there are robust endnotes that fully back up what you guys say, but why did you focus it more as a guide rather than kind of like a traditional educational book?
It seems like it's just a very practical way to go about it to make it very instructive. Just to put it very bluntly, it's also matches Peter's personality to approach things this way. When Peter gives a public talk, and he's told me this, we've been friends for getting on 10 years now. He's told me this from the beginning. When he does a public talk, one of the key things he always wants to give the audience is that they have to have something practical they can walk away with right now, that they can put into action today based on whatever the content of the talk was. So to write the book as kind of a guide that would walk somebody through or help people, literally just see very much like a series of techniques that have explanations behind them that build on one another to improve their ability to have contentious conversations across religious or political or ideological divides seemed to be the way to go. And I think it was the right choice looking back at it.
And I think we'll dig into some of the more contentious conversations in a second, but I did want to talk about one thing briefly that was in the book that I think is really important. And that's the unread library effect. This idea that people think they know things just because somebody else knows it. Like this idea of just owning the library book gives you the knowledge in it. It's something that I've seen a lot. I see a lot in my work. I'm a Second Amendment attorney, a constitutional litigator. And you hear this all the time of, well, that's constitutional, or, oh, that's unconstitutional. And most people haven't read the Constitution or or the supporting documents. But I've also been guilty of it myself, for sure. So do you have any recommendations on how somebody avoids kind of falling victim to that on both sides? One, from being overly confident yourself, and two, from falling into this idea of somebody else just authoritatively citing something at you that you might not know one way or the other, but they probably don't either.
Right. So it's really actually interesting that it's based off of a result in cognitive science. And so the book actually advises both sides of your question. The advice applies to both people. And so the idea is that people think they know things because those things are known. So they know that, like the classic example that they actually give in the source literature is that people think they know how a toilet works. It's a very simple object. You have one, you're familiar with it, you've used it probably today. But if you actually had to plumb one, you can't do it, right? You don't really know how a toilet works. But people, when they asked on a scale of 1 to 10, rate how confident you are in, how certain you are about how a toilet works, people rated themselves a 7, 8, whatever. And then what they did then was, as an experiment, was they took them aside and said, okay, now what you're going to do is, in your own words, write an essay that explains how a toilet works. And they spent 20, 30 minutes doing this. And then on the way out, as an exit survey, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, rate how confident you are in your knowledge about how a toilet works. And the average dropped from somewhere between 7 and 8 to somewhere between 4 and 5. So what happened was people revealed their own ignorance to themselves by having to engage in the explanation. And I think we've all had that experience where somebody asks you a question, you're in the unread library situation, you think you know something and you start trying to explain it, and you're kind of doing the well, and you can't quite put the dots together, and whatever the other person thinks of you is irrelevant. You start to feel uncomfortable with your level of knowledge. And what they found is, whether it's a toilet or a mechanical device or, something physical, or if it's a political belief, like, or a political issue like immigration or whatever, that if you actually get people to try to explain it in their own words, what they often end up doing is revealing their own ignorance to themselves. And so if you want to safeguard for yourself, first of all, you have to have the humility to do the experiment, but you need to sit down and try to explain, either in writing or type it out, or talk to your friends and lovers. Sorry, talk to somebody, and you're like, try to explain whatever the thing is. And what you'll find is, most of the time, unless you are genuinely an expert, you will actually moderate your belief. On the other hand, if you want to do it in the other direction, it's very simple. Just continue to ask people to explain various details. How's that going to work? What's going to happen? These questions are very unsettling. How is that supposed to work? Who's going to pay for that? That's a very interesting theory you have about how we can improve education, but what's going to happen in practice, and what are you going to do to hold it accountable, and what is it going to cost, and who's going to pay for it, and what are going to be the outcomes, and what is how does it work to get from this idea of a policy to the outcomes that you're proposing that the policy will have? Walk us through it. And what happens is, again, it doesn't always work. Some people are just Dunning-Kruger, but on the other hand, it often does work. It will get people to moderate their belief, and at the end of the day, feel like they actually need to return to and do, like, intellectually honest people will return to the literature and want to do more study, or they'll moderate how they speak about the issue if that feeling arises in them that they're not clear. So asking those hard questions of yourself and revealing your own ignorance, finding the weaknesses in your argument. You should always be looking for the weaknesses in your argument, or asking the kinds of questions that show somebody that, they don't know the details as well as they think they do.
Yeah, and I think that's a really effective mentorship tool that a lot of my mentors have used, and I might not have even noticed, of this idea. You walk in and you confidently state something, and a couple pointed questions focused on what undermines that view, or what you came to that view, why you came to that view, has been a very effective tool for me in learning, and for other people in helping me learn. I think it's really interesting that we don't really talk about that much.
Right. And compare that to the other possibility that you come in and you confidently assert something that happens to be kind of dumb. And then the person's like, that's idiotic. Here's why. Compare the two reactions, right? A lot of people, their pride gets on the line, and they're going to get defensive, and they're going to double down into their view. But if you ask those questions, it's like, okay, I'm interested in this. you might be onto something, explain how it's supposed to work, and then all of a sudden you're fumbling around. Like they bring you into that level of like, oh, I'm actually interested in this, I want to know how this is supposed to work, and then you realize you can't put the dots together. Then all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, I guess we're gonna have to, I think it's a good idea still, but we're gonna have to rethink it a little. So it gets completely different reactions to take those two different approaches.
And I think part of the key, what you said there, right, is being actually interested. It can't be
Yes.
this kind of just surface level of, oh, I'm going to show you that you're not accurate in your beliefs because I'm just going to point and poke and prod, but truly being interested in what underlies those beliefs and how they came there.
That's right. That's right.
So then let's jump to the opposite side of this, social media. So you and Dr. Bogosian kind of caution against getting into arguments on social media, especially on Twitter. But you also yourself have a very distinctive personality on Twitter.
Yes.
Do you think that there's a role for that kind of more combative approach at times on social medias, or are these different personas that people should look at? Or are you doing this for a very particular purpose in your daily social use?
All of the above. It turns out that Twitter, social media in general, is a very particular arena. And so the old aphorism, of course, is when in Rome, do as the Romans. And so I think the mistake people make is that believing Twitter is a conversation. There are conversations on Twitter, but not public ones. The real conversations that happen on Twitter are happening direct messages, or we have an exchange in the public, and then you reach out and we have a podcast together or something like this. What's happening on the public stage of Twitter is, whether you like it or not, and whether it's your intention or not, whether it's what you're trying to accomplish or not, it is a performance. It is a performance to that medium, because people are watching. And when people are watching, you're not having a conversation in nearly the same way as you would if it was just two dudes or two people sitting down face to face, or person to person, and just kind of, let's talk through this. Let's try not to be assholes to each other. It's a very different thing. And so I see Twitter as it's basically like a dunk fest. And and it's structurally a dunk fest. And so if you try to fight the current of that, you're not going to change it. The dunkers are going to win every time. And so it's always going to trend toward dunkery. And so it makes more sense to participate in the environment the way that you would participate in the environment. It's like saying, nobody in normal life, you're never going to walk down the street and just think of like clobbering the guy next to you and knocking him down, right? You're just not going to do it. But if you stepped on a football field, that's exactly the behavior you would expect. So Twitter, in a sense, I've actually called it literally the arena for our time, is a particular environment that should be behaved in as though it's a particular environment. And it's the category error is believing that Twitter is a place for conversation. It's not in the behavior on Twitter. And so, like, for example, I often get in this position and I get accused of arguing on Twitter, but I virtually never argue on Twitter. I dunk on Twitter. I make fun of on Twitter. I say crazy stuff on Twitter, but I almost never substantively, and I get people come at me mad all the time over it. I don't substantively engage with people on Twitter. So, and they're mad. Well, you don't even why would you substantively engage on a social media platform that's literally built for every type of substantive engagement to get taken out of context and fall apart? So you don't do it. You play the game according to the rule. You wouldn't go out on the football field, thinking you're going to like play soccer and nobody can touch you and you're going to like kick the ball around. It's a different environment. And so, I still stand by, I don't even try to have conversations, but I certainly don't want to argue on Twitter. It's just, if you want to argue or you want to have a conversation, take it into the direct messages or get on the phone. And I stand by that advice, but you have to understand that the platform itself has a particular structure that lends itself to a particular way. And it's the old advice also, don't piss into the wind. So, people think that this is a contradiction, but I think the people who think this is a contradiction are about 5 years behind in understanding what Twitter is for and what Twitter does and how Twitter operates and what Twitter's structural components generate in terms of a kind of dialogical space.
That's really interesting. And I think it's really interesting that you say, when you want to have that conversation, take it off Twitter. Take it onto the phone, take it into the DMs, have an actual conversation with somebody.
I've had so many people come to me in my DMs and they say, so we have some little like dunk fest spat on the public. And they come into my DMs and they're like, you're so reasonable. And this is perfectly cheerful conversation. And like, it's happened so many times. It's like, yeah, you're on the stage, man. The stage is a different environment than, finding a corner in the back of the auditorium and having a quiet talk.
It's like when you watch a fight and you see two guys fight it out for 25 minutes or for a whole boxing match or in MMA. And then afterwards they walk into the center and they hug and they chat and they have a real conversation.
Yeah. And then they go get a beer or something together, like, because they're both fighters. They're both in the same. I mean, a lot of them don't like each other and there's whatever, but no, it's the truth. It's like, you have to understand the environment, and each of the social media platforms is its own environment with its own incentive structures and its own things that create, advantage or brand disadvantage or whatever. And so you actually have to understand that they operate in that regard, and you have to play according to what those, you could say, no, you have to be perfectly full of integrity and always behave the same in all environments. But that's ridiculous. If you walked out onto a football field and didn't expect to get tackled, you're probably going to get hurt.
Yeah, I think that's great. And then so when you get into these substantive conversations, I think one of the things that's really difficult and is touched on briefly in the book, but I think actually informs a lot of your other work as well, is when you get into the substantive conversation and, you're open to listening, you're open to learning, how do you deal with this kind of base issue that we're seeing now on a total disagreement as to what language means oftentimes, or what terms mean? That seems to be the next thing that really makes it difficult for people to have conversations.
Oh, it is. It's fatal to the ability to have conversations. In fact, I've been putting a lot of thought into this over the past few years, as you might imagine, and trying to sort it out. And to be honest with you, I only feel like I'm just now cracking the surface of that question. Like, what is the relationship between word and meaning? Why is it necessary to preserve that? What does it mean when it isn't? What is the purpose? I mean, I don't mean to get into deep philosophy of language. We don't have to go like full Wittgenstein here, but or Cyril. But what is the purpose of language? And I honestly I began way before this. I figured this out when I was in college, 20 years ago, that the purpose of language is to create. I didn't know there was a name for it at the time, but it's to create what's known as shared intentionality or shared intention. So I have an idea in my mind. Maybe it's an orange, and I want to communicate that idea so that you have that idea in your mind as well. And the goal of using language is so that we both form. The goal of using language in an effective way is that we both form the same idea in our mind. There, of course, you can deceive as well, right? I could use language in a way that intentionally gives you a misimpression. I could also just be sloppy in my own understanding and unable to articulate it. And so I don't even know what my intention is. So I can't use language accurately enough to give you the same intention. And we might even mistakenly agree or believe that we have the same intention when we don't. These are the challenges of having our own minds that are totally isolated from one another, whether we like it or not, and having to use a medium like language to try to create that shared intention so we can create shared goals, shared understanding, or, clarify our disagreements or whatever they happen to be. And so I'm just now realizing, and especially with the advent of social media, what it's done to the world, is that there is an incredible need for us to start getting very deep philosophically in terms of understanding human beings' relationship to meaning through language, and what that means in terms of having to be quite clear about kind of drawing lines around something very organic, like the meaning of a word. Obviously, slang, I mean, Brandon means something now. Slang evolves all the time, right? Mm-hmm. You have to deal with that. And it's not even totally clear what Brandon means. Brandon means a number of things. It means, that maybe you don't like the current president, but it also means maybe that you want to see America succeed, with the let's go being, sarcastic in the first case and the let's go being literal in the second case. Let's go, Brandon, let's get America back on track. Let's go, Brandon. And it's F Joe Biden, so this happens. So language is a very complicated device in that regard. But I honestly think of it this way, which I think you'll like. Just like Locke realized in the early 18th century, and late 17th century, I'd have to remember exactly his dates, but around the time, just like Locke realized that there was something absolutely fundamental to property rights that generate the capacity for liberty. Like if you don't have them, you're at too much risk, and so you don't have liberty. There's also something parallel, since we now spend 50% there or thereabouts of our time in this kind of rhetorical online space. It's rhetorically driven. There's something in parallel to property rights that has to exist around stabilizing the meaning of words in order to communicate clearly, that was less important when everything, literally everything now is broadcast, right? In a sense, when you put it on social media, I could tweet anything in any given day and it maybe gets 10 likes and nobody sees it, or it could go nuts and get 1 million or 10 million. It could get 1 billion impressions. It's totally plausible, right? And that could happen. It's not likely, but it could happen. And that's literally broadcasting. So every time we communicate now, there's an element of this broadcast that wasn't there before. When I was a kid, it was in the 80s and early 90s. It was like a huge deal to go on TV at all, even like little local news. It simply wasn't possible to speak in a way, except at the upper crust of society who have access to these kinds of levers and microphones to broadcast your ideas. And so now we're in a fundamentally different paradigm where everybody has the capacity to be a broadcaster, sometimes by accident at any given moment. And we have to deal with that because it's a total shift. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just cracking into it. There's something in parallel to Locke's property rights where the ability to maintain property stably that the government can't take away from you gives you the capacity to enjoy other liberties, because your home, for example, if you own it, is not technically at risk. The property that you own, the food that you have, the currency that you carry to be able to buy goods or procure services is not at risk if you have a fundamental right to your own property. Something like this must exist around the idea of meaning, because if there's no ability to attach stable meaning, and it doesn't mean every word has to have one clear-cut scientific definition or whatever, but if we can't talk back and forth and agree that the words that we're using mean particular things in this particular context for this particular dialogue, then we can't generate that shared intention. We can't understand one another, and there cannot be a conversation except the attempt to understand one another across that gap. And so it's a completely deleterious to conversation to have words that are being used to do what I refer to as strategic equivocation, where somebody knows that they have two meanings to the word, or maybe they're not. I think I just had a conversation this weekend. It was really a mess. And I occasionally felt like the people I was speaking with knew that the words meant more than one thing. And then occasionally I got the strong impression that they did not know, that they were sliding between two different definitions of the same word in the same conversation, which makes a stable dialogue virtually impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamental to that conversation that the words that I say conjure the same pictures in your mind as they do in mine. Otherwise, we're not really having a true conversation anymore.
That's right. We're talking literally about different things in each other's directions, and that can be used. It can just be confusion, but it can also be deceptive. It's in fact, there's this whole thing called con artistry. The whole game is to deceive people using language, or I said con artistry, but I could have said politics. The whole game is to deceive people using cleverly dressed up language couched in stirring rhetoric that rather than adding clarity adds confusion and to the situation that can then be exploited by, say, somebody operating in mala fide, whereas somebody who's operating in good faith, on the other hand, would just be confused and not sharp enough. And of course it's hard to parse those things, because you can't accuse people of being in bad faith if they're trying and just sloppy. But it's very difficult. But so there's something here, because our information spaces that we inhabit and will continue to inhabit is fundamentally different than it's ever been in human history. And we haven't had our John Locke come out yet and lay down the philosophy of language that somehow indicates the necessity of stable meaning to language that we're going to use, and not for fun, but for any productive or important purpose. It's the old Humpty Dumpty thing from Alice in Wonderland. Words mean what I mean them to mean when I use them, and nothing more, nothing less. No, that's literally the thing that has to be kicked out. We have to be able to say there are stable definitions that we can agree upon, and this is the one that we're speaking about. And also the death of the author. So I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. The death of the author thing, where you get to interpret my words how you feel you should interpret them. No, I have, if you want, authorial intent, and discovering what that is matters. And so in some sense, I have, like a property right, I have a fundamental right to my intentions, and you don't get to presume my intentions. We can discuss them. We can try to uncover if there's something there that I may not be aware of psychologically or whatever, but I have a fundamental right to my intentions, and my intentions, that fundamental right, proceeds in terms of like the content of my communication. These issues are this is a profoundly deep and important problem right now that we have not solved because we didn't need to solve it before.
That's interesting. Yeah. And while we don't have, our current lock on language, hopefully whoever that comes out is more readable than Wittgenstein, because I couldn't get through anything.
Yeah, I was going to say it probably is Wittgenstein, but who can read it?
Who can figure out what that says?
He's so smart. He's super hard to read.
But that this book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, might not be the lock on language that we need, but I do think it gives readers that ability to start accessing what other people mean by words. So, James, I think that's about the time that we have for today. I thank you so much for joining us. I strongly encourage people to go out and to read How to Have Impossible Conversations, to start getting at those questions of how can I overcome the unread library effect? How can I get to this point of language? So thank you for joining us today on Liberty Chats. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media. Follow the Steamboat Institute on our social media channels. Also follow James Lindsay at Conceptual James, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Awesome. And so thank you so much. And we'll see you guys next time.
For sure.